I wanted to just quickly introduce our panelists who you can read their full illustrious bios, but I thought I'd just briefly introduce them for those of you who haven't had time. All the way to my left, we have Dr. Martin Chalfie, who, among other things, is a Nobel laureate and a professor at Columbia University and the former chair of the Department of Biological Sciences. And immediately to Dr. Chalfie's right, we have Dr. Gregory Stock, who is a leading authority on the broad impacts of genomics. He's looked at some of the application of cutting-edge technologies, what it means, the ethics and the implications, as well as conducting research. And then immediately to my left, we have Dr. Stuart Firestein, who is the former chair of Columbia University's Department of Biological Sciences and is looking into I guess, the science of smell and its application. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to leave most of the talking to our panelists. I would like to sort of have a conversational feel. I think they agree, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end and dialogue with the audience members. But what I wanted to sort of throw out there just as a first proposition is that we've been hearing and reading a lot about, especially from leaders of the sort of IT revolution, that the next big wave, Steve Jobs famously said in his last years of life that he thought that the intersection between bioscience and technology was the next big future wave of the economy, of the insights. Bill Gates has said similar things. Paul Allen, Bill Gates' co-founder, has devoted much of his wealth to starting a brain sciences institute. I'd like to get your thoughts on, in the first instance, is this sort of a lot of, wishful thinking? Are we really there yet in terms of having this kind of be the next big driver of the economy and of our knowledge economy?
Certainly hate to disagree with Jobs, Gates, Allen, and Ellison. I suppose that's not likely to be a good position to take. But so you hope that they're right about that. But I don't think the development is as easy in some ways as the technology development was, as developments in technology were, and they may have a somewhat rosy view. I think that's quite possibly true. I think Greg would probably know more about that sort of getting from the bench to the bedside business, or the bench to the point where you have a cure, a treatment, something of that nature. I think it's a little trickier than getting from the keyboard to the gadget somehow or another.
Now, I would absolutely agree with that, although if you think of it in terms of the big picture of where things are going, the centrality of what's happening in the life sciences, I think, can't be disputed at all. I think that if you look at the future, at this in the context of humanity's future, and it's much bigger than that. There are some fundamental occurrences right now in the history of life that are without precedent. And one of these is the Silicon Revolution. Essentially, all of the things that are associated with that. If you step back a little bit, what's happening is that we're taking the sand at our feet. We're taking in the inanimate world and we're animating it. We're breathing a level of complexity into it that kind of rivals life itself. And nothing is ever going to be the same as the result of that, especially when you project forward just a little ways. And the second big revolution, which is a child of that first and would not have been possible without that first revolution, is the biotech revolution, and its sort of poster child is the genomics revolution and that project. But essentially, life through us and through these activities is coming to understand its own workings at quite an intimate level, and is beginning to tinker and alter and change that. And that is huge as well. So life is beginning to take control of its own processes. And I think the idea that it's going to be a short path is a false one, but that image is really very relevant of that happening, I believe. And if you project forward very far, it is central, and it's because we're biological creatures. This is what we care about. If we can actually begin, even to imagine that you could change things that are as fundamental biologically as our lifespans. Think how that would change everything in the world, and it's not beyond the sense of possibility that we could do that. We're understanding these processes, and in the functionings of our brain, for instance, we're beginning to intervene and alter the way we feel about things, change our emotions. in a sense that this has driven our activity. I mean, we seek out things that over a long evolutionary past have served us well. And now we can short circuit those in many ways. So these are the kinds of things that I think are captured by that.
I want to come back to the question of sort of aging stuff, but I would love your perspective, Dr. Chalfie, on the notion, I mean, you have been recognized for massive breakthroughs, hugely important breakthrough in science. The relationship between that discovery phase and the application phase from your vantage point of the work you've done with jellyfish protein, what have you seen?
Well, I was thinking about this, the whole thing, and thinking about, when did the revolution start? And the revolution starts for electronics and computers with the transistor. And that's not far different from the start of the biological revolution, which is the elucidation of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick in the early 1950s. So we're talking about something that has been a revolution for a half a century. And all of these things have sort of been changing sort of in pace. There's no doubt that technological changes give rise to an enormous increase in knowledge, which then begets other technological changes and keeps working together. So to me, these things have been going in pace, and I think maybe the world is sort of concentrating on, look at what's happening in biology now, basically because of the changes that have been wrought since the human genome was sequenced. But in fact, the revolution is already still going on in electronics and in engineering, as well as what's going on in biology. I think this is, in a sense, the science du jour that people are sort of being excited about. And there's a lot to be excited about. There are lots of new things that are taking place in biology that we never would have imagined 5, 10 years ago.
So on that, you brought up the genome. Recently the president announced an endeavor for mapping human brain activity and putting a lot of money into it. And some of the criticism around it was, well, at least with the Human Genome Project, we sort of knew where we were going, knew what the end result was, and can we really, in an area where we have massive need for addressing, diseases that are killing people today, spend this kind of money on a project like that that doesn't have a clear goal in mind. What is your take on that in terms of?
To talk in a more general sense, just this is a topic that I'm very concerned with, is I think as people get older, as I get older, I would love to see more cures for whatever I'm going to start getting. I think people are very concerned about their own health, and I see that there's a lot of suffering that people would like to alleviate, and no one is against that. But it's been the case that the breakthroughs do not come from an immediate looking at a particular disease or a particular problem. In biology, they come from a really broad-based support of basic research that then allows things. And to take one that's not even biological, but when Charles Townes discovered the physics that underlies lasers, he wasn't thinking about CDs. He wasn't thinking about DVDs. And he certainly wasn't thinking about the laser use in surgery, which has been exceptionally important. That these are applications that came after the basic research, but the basic research was absolutely essential. We now know things and are constantly discovering aspects of biology that we haven't known about. And I think we have to counter this idea that somehow we've already learned enough. Most of the genes that have been uncovered because of the Human Genome Project are still described as producing proteins of completely unknown function. We don't know what that is. We don't know how they interact. We have a great deal to learn. So to me, the approach to getting these advances is to be able to have this basic research and the support of the basic research, which I think is so essential for these breakthroughs to be made.
Can I add to the Townes, just to add a little to the Townes story? The Townes story, he was actually, because he did this work at Columbia, he was actually almost ridiculed for it and told to stop, put away that laser nonsense and get to something important. And nobody wanted to invest in it. I mean, you can't imagine a company 25 or 50 years ago now investing in laser research, but you can't imagine a company now that could work without them. So, you know, these things change. Can I tell my favorite quick story? This is, well, it's this sort of basic research story. And it's an anecdote, although it's well documented, so it's true. And it involves Benjamin Franklin, one of our founding fathers and a scientist, I point out, who witnessed the first flight of human beings while he was in Paris. This was, of course, not fixed-wing aircraft, but hot air balloons, the Champ du Mars in Paris. Big demonstration, the first time human beings lifted off the face of the planet. And he was standing there with somebody whose identity has been lost, who said to him, so this is really fun, but what good do you think flight's ever going to be, really? I mean, how important could this ever be? And Franklin's retort famously was, well, what use is a newborn baby? I mean, that may be a little extreme, but it's kind of true. They're not really much use at all. But a few of them turn out, and so we've decided it's worth investing in all of them because the few of them that turn out really do a lot of good.
Yeah, and this notion that the focus on basic research, at least when you talk about big money coming into science, that can't be overstated, I think, because you simply do not know where things go, and it's really very destructive to try and have the micromanagement of research towards practical goals by politicians who have no knowledge at all about science in general and no general perspective on it. And in fact, if your concern is really about immediate applications of research, sort of how you get to treatments for particular diseases and such, the things that have more impact are things like a regulatory framework or such, where we really do not have a very successful and a very effective way of translating the fruits of basic research into practical outcomes. We have lots and lots of barriers because we have a very distorted view of risks and rewards, where there are diffuse rewards that arise out of new therapeutics, generally, and the risks associated with them, or little errors, are often very, very dramatic. And so you tend to have a real conservatism about trying out things, about attempting new possibilities in terms of translation into medicines and
So let me
interventions.
ask the panel, in light of that, I mean, a real endorsement of course, the importance of basic research, and which also requires big money and the funding of big science. Where and how should we think about the appropriate priorities for that? The places where we really need to push the frontier, where we know very little, or where we think we're on the cusp, and big science research would really be demonstrably impactful.
I think we've had this, is that me? Is that my microphone? I think we've had this model for years and years, and we've recently corrupted it. And that's been a huge mistake, and all we have to do is turn back the clock in a way. At least at the National Institutes of Health, it works very simply. 25,000 people a year send in their absolutely best ideas as grant proposals, which are then judged by peer-reviewed panels of other scientists, and the top 20% or so of them were funded. I mean, it's a great marketplace of ideas. That's all it ever was. And that changed beginning in the early years of Bush II's administration to have a far more top-down administrative view of NIH, where administrators and in many cases legislators would have pet projects and say, well, 5% of research should go to AIDS, or 10% should go to junior researchers, any one of which is a program sounds like a good idea and is defensible. But who decided 5%? Who decided 10%? I mean, we don't know. And so quite often what happens is in some areas of research, you're overfunding it, you're funding really crappy stuff by the end of it, and in other areas you're underfunding it terribly and starving it. And so it seems to me the way to do this is a marketplace of ideas, which is what we had, and we should go back to, in my opinion.
And to just sort of reiterate that, sort of mentioned 20% of individual grants. It's actually gotten much, I mean, at one point it could have been 25. So let's say a quarter of the ideas that people present used to be funded. It's now gotten to the point where, because of changes, utilization of money, and different things, not taking into effect inflation and other changes, that the number of grants we now fund are the same, approximately the same number that we funded in 1998. So there has been no increase. So there's less than zero growth in this. And the changes in rules and everything means that the people that were putting in the not very good grants are gone. So if 25% were viewed as fundable, as things that we really wanted to have, or that we were able to get, now that number has grown. I don't know what the exact number is. I'm going to say something like 40%. We're funding at around 10%. So while the number of good grants, the number of talented investigators are presenting really wonderful stuff, what we're seeing is a real reduction in the new ideas that are being able to fund. And I'll give one anecdote because it's one that I particularly like. I have a friend who works on, he's at SUNY Buffalo. He works on a project that most people would find rather strange. It's a project in which he looks at what happens when he pokes cells and how the cells respond to being pushed and pulled. And for a while, people didn't believe that he actually had anything, that this was really a subject for study. And then he was able to show that he was able to do this. Not only that, he was able to show that something in tarantula toxin venom actually blocks the effects of the cell's ability to move. He discovered this about 10 or so years ago, and he's been working with people on this for all that time, and there are no clinical trials, although the compound has now been given orphan drug approval by the FDA, which means clinical trials can be. But in laboratory tests, this may be effective for things such as muscular dystrophy, sickle cell anemia, atrial fibrillation, a number of different conditions where cells are stretched or not stretched appropriately. He sends in his grant. He gets a score that says he's in the top 9%. And his institute of the Institutes of Health says, we're funding to 6. We're not going to do this. He has people that have been with him for 12 years or more, and by losing his funding, it means he loses them and he cannot replace them. So the research stops. Fortunately, there was a change sort of in the budget. They were able to fund to 11%. So he actually is continuing his research. I'm concerned about the people at 12 and 13 and 14 and 20%.
Because remember, this is not a normal distribution of grants. The only people that get to hand these grants in are people with PhDs who run laboratories, who have years of experience. So, you know, it's this kind of a curve. It's not that kind of a curve. So when you say the top 25% or the top 12%, you're really getting a very, very thin sliver. It's not like you can, oh, well, we'll just get rid of the tails and it'll be fine.
And the other thing is that these efforts are of such magnitude, the amount of research that's done in the United States, that has in fact been the driver of the economy since World War II. The estimate is almost 50% of the U.S. economy has been based, the growth in the U.S. economy has been based on increases, on science and technology knowledge, that we're losing out constantly.
So you raise a nice segue. So last week, Google made some waves by announcing that it was starting or investing in a company that was going to be looking at aging and diseases of aging and taking on the cause of aging. So in an environment in which we're seeing reduced amounts of funding coming from government, is this a good thing? I mean, if we have, you know, private sector companies that have the resources to be able to do some frontier science.
My point is a little bit different, that these one-off efforts to build a company, and that's all wonderful. Drug companies are not really looking into developing new drugs anymore. They've given up on that part of it. The only funder of funding at the moment is the federal government to any really great extent. Google, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Gates Foundation cannot, on a year-by-year basis, match what has been happening for U.S. science over these times, and that has been so productive. So these things are not contributing as much.
It's also worth pointing out that that I think a week ago also the Ellison Foundation, which had been devoted to aging, decided to quit. So, after 10 years or something, and so a lot of people had developed programs and this and that, hired people, and then
We're talking about two different realms, though. One is basic research, which is fundamental to creating sort of the possibilities that then might be translatable either now or at some point in the future into therapeutics and interventions that have impacts on people's lives. And the other is focused efforts to make these translations happen more quickly. And there is not very much expenditure that's going on in terms of translating the basic research into interventions that are useful to people. And there are so many obstacles to that happening. And when you're trying to form companies, I've formed several startup companies that are dealing with these sorts of issues, from diagnostics like our sensitivity to environmental toxins like mercury to therapeutics for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. The path to actually getting a drug or an intervention and the amounts of money that are involved make it very, very difficult to justify the expenditures for most entities. And venture doesn't intervene very much. The pharmaceutical companies are not interested in early stage research by and large. So it's a huge problem. And the answer is not to pull money away from basic research to somehow make these little ill-advised kind of targeted efforts to create the next big drug, because you don't know where these things are going to lead. The breakthroughs are uncertain. There's serendipity. And so, to me, you have to think of ways of lowering the barriers to trial and error, to seeing what works with people, and also really massively make efforts into basic research.
So let's get a little prescriptive for just a minute. People talk a lot about the regulatory environment being unduly onerous and a real barrier to that kind of translation. But what about, and so we should talk about that, but additionally you see, for example, the government trying to lead consortiums with pharmaceutical companies to tackle things like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. What about new models of collaboration and new models of what should we be looking to do to speed up translation pathways, if anything? What are the new emerging things that seem like they could be promising?
So in my view, their bureaucracies are ponderous. They're the antithesis of the kinds of things the creative insights that lead to innovations. And the pathway to trying to actually see whether something works in a clinical environment, you want to really be thinking of how you can get the early stages of either affirmation or falsifying those possibilities, and get them quickly and cheaply. And that's not what is occurring, what the situation is today. You have to get so much that goes into creating even the simplest of clinical tests that there's a tendency to really layer on all sorts of activities onto selection of early molecules and early interventions that just makes a very sort of sclerotic sort of process.
I think you're right, though. I mean, it's that sort of middle area. So basic research, which I think we all agree should go back to higher levels of support that it's had, because that's sort of the fountain, that's the wellspring of all this stuff. But a good basic research discovery, it's pretty obvious quite often what to do with it. I mean, it doesn't take a super brain to go, oh, this could really work doing that. And people will have that idea. It's getting from there to the next step. I agree, that's the most difficult, because the pharmaceutical companies have put themselves up kind of in the Broadway model. It's either $1 billion drug or it's just not worth it. A $200 million drug, forget it. I can't imagine what's wrong with $200 million personally, but for some reason or another, Big Pharma is not interested in anything less than $1 billion drug. Well, there just aren't going to be that many of them, and indeed, how many have we had in the past several years? That pipeline has unfortunately gone quite dry, which is problematic, I think.
If I can give an example, you asked me earlier about the work that I was honored for. So I had shown that a small protein that was fluorescent could be used to label things in cells, and you could watch various aspects of life happen in real time. And when I published this, I thought that this was going to be just this terrific thing for this mythical organization that companies had called research and development. That there was going to be someone, I wasn't going to waste my time making it brighter, making it different colors, working out the kinks, but there would be some company that would see the worth of this and develop this. And I found to my dismay, this was about 1994, that there were no companies that wanted to do this. No one took it up as an opportunity. What they wanted is they wanted other people to do it, and then they licensed to sell it. And that was uniform across the board. I should say that this material now has been used, the estimate is in something like 160,000 research papers and used in many different ways. But it was actually quite depressing to me that people didn't see, or it wasn't that they didn't see the advantages of doing this, but they would rather wait, have somebody else do it, and then license it rather than do the development. That was, to me, quite depressing.
So is this a problem of needing to change an incentive model so that we're incentivizing in that middle place where things are dying? And what does a new incentive model look like? Or is it in part, or maybe the answer is both, in part a problem of how the discovery process ultimately the information gets disseminated to a broader audience. So for example, you make the point about blockbuster pharmaceutical drugs. Well, many of those discovery pathways ultimately fail, right? And the information then isn't put out to researchers who may be able to take what appears to be a failure to a pharmaceutical company that wants $1 billion drug, but could turn out to be a $200 million drug that would alleviate or be an appropriate intervention. So what can we do? What should we be thinking about doing to change the incentive structure or to be opening up scientific data and information for further collaboration?
This sort of takes us a little bit back to where you started, which is, and what you do, which is the value of the sort of the silicon technology in biology, because I couldn't agree more with you. This has always been a problem in biology. What do we do with negative results? Basically, the way we've solved this in the past, I think, is you go to meetings, and then you go to the bar afterwards, and you get somebody loaded enough to tell you what didn't work, and then you don't have to do it too. They don't actually have to be loaded. They'll tell you right away. But you buy somebody a drink, and then you talk about what you've done and what they've done, and this hasn't worked, why hasn't worked, and that's kind of the way negative results got around. That's become more and more difficult just because the communities have gotten larger, and there's not enough crosstalk between them. And so this notion of online publication now, open source publication, one hopes, there's always the issue of how much can a human being read in a single lifetime. If we're going to just now increase the literature by 10 or 20 times to put negative results in as well as positive ones, we'll have to figure out how to filter that somehow, but I trust those things will happen. But I think that's an important influence.
And you talk about incentives. Well, it's not like people who are running companies are idiots, although some of them certainly are. But if the incentives, it's very, very difficult right now. There's this desire across all realms for some sort of safety because there's great uncertainty today in the financial realms. And there are huge regulatory uncertainties that are tacked on to anything. There are huge uncertainties about reimbursement that are tacked on to anything. If you look at the time that's required now in order to be safe about everything so that there are no mistakes, it's huge. So these are very, very difficult, enormous commitments. And sometimes you would want it to just be a little nimbler and rougher, it seems to me. And I think that will probably happen because this is an international environment, and as you begin to get things that are working, then, it's kind of the Wild West in certain places, China and elsewhere. And so that's a good thing in my view, because it's just the expenses for individuals in their careers in a regulatory situation or in a corporate situation are highest for making mistakes, not for getting something started down a path that's successful. And to me, you have to recognize that there are risks in life that cannot be avoided, and that everything can't be perfectly safe. Drugs or poisons. I mean, we have to sort of be realistic about a lot of these things if we want to make progress, in my view.
So what about the regulatory environment? Or, sorry, Dr. Shelby, if you want to follow up on that.
I was going to bring up an example of the Hereditary Disease Foundation. So whether this exactly goes into industry or businesses, I'm not sure, but it was a very interesting way. They were desperate to find the gene that was the basis of Huntington's disease. And the standard models that everybody had is that everybody worked on it. It was maybe a funding agency, they'd apply for grants. They did a very different thing. They went to people and they said, we have money. We will give you money to work on this, but here are our conditions. You're all working as a consortium. You're going to meet every 6 months, and you're going to tell all of your information to everybody else in all the so-called competing labs. You have to, and when the gene is found, we don't care which lab finds it first. Everybody's name is on the paper. Everybody gets credit. It's the Hereditary or Huntington's Disease Collaborative. This was also done with atrophic ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And the same thing was done. We have money. You don't have to take our money. You can keep yourself secret. You can do it all on your own if you want, but we can also collaborate. And that succeeded. It wasn't another group that did it. It was all these people contributing all their information to a common goal. And I think that works out very nicely. It has, at least in these two conditions. I think the public effort for the Human Genome Project was like this as well. Information was given freely out while it was being amassed. It wasn't sold to people, and people contributed their own information along the way, making it more important. So these are approaches that might be able to be made.
And that's certainly very successful, that open source approach, where there are very defined goals.
Sure.
Which is a small set of what the opportunities are, especially if you think in terms of not having micromanaging around direct consequences, what the applications are going to be. And the Human Genome Project, which you used as an example of something that was a great success, when that was first envisaged, no one thought it was going to work. No one really, 10 years sounds wonderful. Well, Jim Watson was articulating that and gaining support for it. It was a way to capture financial support for that project, a big science project, but nobody really believed it.
And most of what's come out of it was not predicted, and most of what was predicted hasn't come out of it, making it nonetheless valuable, mind you. But we didn't know then.
And so these big opportunities with the omic sort of technologies, be that metabolomics and proteomics and such, and sharing that information creates a huge resource for everyone who's trying to work. And that is a model that has to be furthered and
keeping this
strengthened.
information public is exceptionally important.
Right.
And certainly sharing negative results, the efforts to require that in many situations is extraordinarily desirable in terms of more efficiently orienting research.
Right. So it sounds like, in a sense, part of the incentive, right, is the creating the new human kind of behavior incentives, right? So the rush for for credit, we need to rethink potentially how we distribute credit, how we treat data sets in collaborations and with the public information. But I'm also, when you mentioned something interesting about the Human Genome Project, and it maybe ties back to the public's role in this sort of funding question that we find ourselves, which is, there was a sort of space race sense, right? Once the public imagination was captured by the idea that we could really do this, an audacious goal, but an achievable one. What, in your view, and I know you've thought a lot about sort of the lay public and science, are we doing a good enough job with some of our new frontier technologies and creating a sense in the public that this is of critical importance and relevant?
Well, it's not going to surprise anybody for me to say that we seem to be doing an incredibly terrible job, which begins with our educational system. In the second grade, All the kids are interested in science, the girls and the boys. They're curious, they're inquisitive, they go to science museums, they play in the dirt, they fart around, they do things, you know. By the 11th grade, fewer than 5% of our students are interested in a career in science or in having everything to do with science. So we have apparently developed an educational system that's maximally efficient at removing any interest in science from most of the students. Now, I know that's not what we want, but it's what we have. So this clearly has to change from the beginning. I mean, we were talking earlier, I come to call this the bulimic model of education, where we engorge students with facts, and then they go over here and puke it up on an exam, and then they go home, you know, with no appreciable gain. But that, you know, engorging rather than engaging is not what we need to be doing. And so you're talking about engagement, and that's what I think we have to begin thinking about. But that has to begin with the education of science. Not just the education of scientists, but the education of the so-called, I hate this word, lay public. I make it sound like a religious thing. But those people who are not going to be scientists, but who are going to be policymakers, who are, you know, going to be advisors and hold office and heads of companies and voters, that these people need to be engaged in science too, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be. The greatest adventure we have going on since Newton.
I think that is the key point, is the inspirational aspect of this. This really is a fundamental transition in the history of life. We're like, have a privilege, it's an enormous privilege, to be able to just watch what is happening. I mean, this is unbelievable. Nothing like this has happened in 500 million years, since single cells came together to form multicellular organisms.
Even since we've had brains this big, for hundreds of thousands of years, people would live an entire lifetime under a single technology. They would never see it change. Generations would go by and it was still the Stone Age, or the Brass Age, or the Bronze Age. I mean, whole generations of people. Now, you know, we were joking earlier about this phone. This is better than what Ronald Reagan ran the country on, you know. So it's crazy. I mean, the speed of it, and yet we have not adopted science differently. We still publish journals the way Newton started.
I mean, there are efforts in that. The New
Makes
York
sense.
Science Festival is an example to sort of make it interesting, to make it exciting for people, because these advances in technology and basic science are what are reshaping our world. I mean, you bring up the cell phone. Look at how that has just changed the world entirely. And then we're scrambling to try and sort of respond to it, to survive, to these shifts. I mean, it's amazing what has happened. It's amazing that there's not more turbulence going on in the world. Suddenly the world has come together, and several 3 or 4 billion new people have really joined the world community in an active, rich, connected way. It's not surprising that there are a few growing pains. This is kind of a birth that's occurring. So to me, this concept, this sort of idea of that this is coming out of basic science and technology, and that is a very exciting realm, and to try and sort of where that is leading us, to figure out about that is, to me, what will be inspiring and really is an understanding that's important when we think about where the world is going.
That is a great place to stop for a moment, and I would like to open up the discussion to the audience. I think we have 10 minutes here, so why don't we just start with a couple of questions and see how we do.
Oh, thank you. Is that on? Can you hear me? I'm John Allen from Greater China Corporation. Maybe it's time to say stop, time out, because what I'm hearing here are things that will change humanity as we know it. You know, singularity for the brain, or cloning, or genomics, and even things like nuclear fusion instead of nuclear fission. These are things that within a time framework of 10, 20, 30 years will change humanity as we know it. But my question is this: how are we going to govern these accelerating technologies for the benefit rather than the detriment of humanity?
A fantastic question. And the idea, first of all, the premise that we could say stop if we wanted to is wrong. We could not. These things have huge dynamics that are moving forward, and all of these technologies have two faces. We're devoting a fortune to try and cure diseases in the life sciences and intervene to extend people's lifespans, lifetimes a little bit. And all those have fundamental, very powerful possibilities because we're understanding the workings of life. You know, The same thing is happening with other technologies, with drones, with computers, with telecommunications. We cannot say stop. Things are moving at an ever-accelerating pace, it seems, and we need to try and respond to them as best we can and nudge things a little bit in one way or the other, perhaps. But we don't have control of it. It is outside of our individual controls. It's a process. This is an emergent phenomenon.
I have to say also, I mean, not to beat a horse or anything here, but it's an educational issue, in my opinion. I mean, this country is being run by a Congress that has one scientist currently among all the legislators. Among the entire House, Representative, and Senate, we have one scientist. Germany is being run currently by a country that, by a president who happens to be a chemist, trained chemist, for whatever else you may say about Angela. And it's not even that we need more scientists. But as I say, I think we need a more sophisticated public that's capable of understanding how we do want to govern these things and can talk to scientists about how they ought to be governed. I don't think any of us are against regulatory issues or government as long as they're reasonable. It's when they become unreasonable, silly, or irrational that we kind of chafe against them in some ways.
And they're very difficult because by the time you reach consensus on what a response should be, that response is often out of date, okay? We're responding to a situation that existed a decade or a decade and a half ago and can actually exacerbate the problem. It's very difficult to get something into a legislative form, into laws, and very difficult to get it out.
Yeah. Let's have a question here.
Hi, my name is Misty Ushio, and I'm with Harris & Harris Group, an early-stage venture investing group in New York City. And you've certainly hit on a lot of topics that we think about on a daily basis, the gap in funding for commercialization. But the point I wanted to really go back to is really more about the scientist in me and sort of that world that I left behind a little bit, is this idea that universities are sort of the foundation of the creation of new knowledge. And this other trend in NIH funding, one that the funding lines are going way down, but also there seems to be more and more emphasis or accountability on the applications of the research. And for me, that's great because everyone's already thought through where they're headed. But I think, and I think all of you sort of mentioned, ideas and new knowledge that happens over here might have a tremendous impact over here, but that isn't really realized 20 years later or longer. And so I'm just wondering, from your perspective, does it concern you that there's this trend from kind of this fundamental funding source that requires more and more application to basic research?
It clearly does. I mean, one of the aspects of every NIH grant is that we have to say not only what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, but we have to show the significance. What's the importance of the work? And it's turned out in the last couple of years that some of the evaluating groups, the study sections at NIH, have taken that the definition of significance is translational research. So someone in our department, for example, doing X-ray crystallography on a protein to understand the protein, a very basic problem, got his grant back saying, this has no translational aspect. We're not going to fund you. This is an appalling situation, a very nearsighted situation that has crept in. There's now been enough of a reaction that it's sort of going in the other way. Universities, which I've always liked being at a university because basically nobody tells me what to do. They just want me to succeed. They don't care what I do it in, as opposed to a business where if the bottom line requires a shift in the project changes. So I've liked that freedom, but I think that in the last 25 years, universities have suddenly discovered that they make money out of the intellectual property of the people and the licenses.
They're required to by law.
And they now see this as an important funding thing, and so there's a shift within the universities. I find that very disturbing because I think it restricts people and what they can do.
There's a side to this also, which is a second purpose that we haven't mentioned at all here, that only happens in the university setting, as far as I know, and in terms of science, and that is the education of the next generation of scientists. the graduate students and the postdocs who come through our labs and who, spend a lot of time spending money making mistakes and wasting things, but learning. And that's a crucially important part of the expense that you're just not going to legislate out. I mean, you have to let these people kind of make a few mistakes, and a few of their mistakes really work out as well. But that's, and if we don't keep that going, if university labs begin closing down, we're also closing down the next generation of scientists.
Do we have time for another question?
I completely agree with you about
you.
education and being scientifically literate. I think that's a really big problem, especially since I'm a former teacher. I'm Vaughn Rogers from Seton Hall University, graduate school diplomacy and international relations. And I'm really curious, how do you think we can change the scientific educational paradigms that we have right now? I think it's still, like you said, kind of based on a Newtonian industrial and then also industrial revolution education curriculum and system. How can we change that? Because that will not only solve the economic problem with the funding and research and everything, but it'll also solve the overall literacy, particularly in Congress, the Senate.
Well, I can tell you that the Common Core is exactly the wrong way to go. Which is the currently newly enacted legislation this way, or it's almost legislation, the program. This couldn't be further from the way to go, in my opinion. I mean, in the age of Google and Wikipedia, selling facts to people is a ridiculous business model. So if this is what we think we're going to get away with, either in public education, private education, or universities, I think it's a dead end. But the engagement of people, how you make questions out of things, how you understand that the purpose of facts is not to be infallible and to last forever, but to change and give new questions and have new questions arise, this is another story. And I think that's quite teachable, frankly.
And, and there are a lot of new possibilities that are actually very threatening to the university system as a whole and to other current players. An example is, where you get online materials that can be extraordinarily rich and really can bring this sort of basic foundational educational opportunities to people very, very broadly and very, very cheaply. And it's very successful as well, because now you have the best people in the world that are actually able to be talking about ideas and to sort of render possibilities for people generally, which is a huge problem, and that hasn't existed before, but that really threatens a huge funding source for universities, in the same way that there are possibilities for sharing all sorts of information that are through all self-tracking of all sorts of health sort of possibilities that exist today as well. The quantitative self movement is an example where that can replace or supplement the kinds of clinical trials that are extraordinarily expensive in many ways and that are becoming very widespread. I mean, the amount of data that we're collecting and sharing about our own health and about the richness of interventions that we all are partaking of. So to me, it's that kind of facilitation, just as the way there were efforts to really facilitate the sharing of information broadly so that researchers all over the world would have access to details about genomics or proteomics and such.
I think,
So,
or we,
What are we close to discovering and that will make the biggest impact in the next 10 to 20 years?
oh, that one's easy for me. I think we have spent a lot of time over the last 30 or so years using what are called model organisms. We've studied worms and fruit flies and bacteria and mice. And what we're now at the beginning of is a new model organism. It happens to be ourselves. And what we're going to be learning about our biology, not our diseases necessarily, but our biology, just in the same way as cancer, the study of cancer cells. While the goal was to understand how to control cancer, and that has advanced, the study of cancer cells actually taught us an enormous amount about general biology. In the same way, I believe that the study of our genomes in individuals that have diseases, we are going to find much more about the underlying biology in people. Ultimately, that's going to be improving things. So to me, the real change that we're seeing now is that the best way to study humans is to study humans, and then use all the other knowledge to
And let me
part of
just
that.
add something onto that. These are technologies fundamentally, looking at our genetics, sequencing the human genome. It has a price to it. And the prices are coming down to the point where huge amounts of information can be gathered about individuals very broadly. And it is a virtuous circle. This is not a question of the access of the rich versus the poor. It's one generation to the next. And right now, we're at the point where we can get huge amounts of information in terms of genetics or whatever that might be for not just hundreds or thousands of people, but for hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And we can begin to integrate that information, and we're going to find all sorts of things low-hanging fruit that we hadn't suspected before.
And if I could add just one thing to that to answer that gentleman's question earlier, this, while we're very enthusiastic about this also raises new questions that people never thought of before. You go in and have a procedure done at your doctor's office. She asks you to sign a consent form. If they're doing research on what you're doing, now it's routine to have a consent that you agree to the information being distributed in some way. As you get your genome sequenced, you can give permission for your genome to be used for research, and if they swear it's going to be anonymous, that would be fine. But you're also giving information about your parents, your siblings, your children, and they haven't given permission about this, but you've been able to do it. It's a completely different way of looking at this information, and as a study showed earlier this year, we cannot keep any of this anonymous. It's actually sort of impossible because people at MIT or at the Broad Institute up in Boston were able to do a study of taking I think it was 5 individuals, completely anonymous, except that they knew what state they were in, and were able to find those individuals using all the information on the web. So it's it's a new world for us to think about regulations as well.
You thought Facebook was a problem.
Do you use crowdsourcing to get your funds in? Have you ever tried that? Maybe you should. I mean, because maybe some institutions are not listening to you, but maybe the people will if you market yourself with your research and all that. There could be possibility of
I've found for
crowdsourcing.
myself that I've been funded for all the 32 years I've been a faculty member. I've been funded by the National Institutes of Health. That may change next month, but we'll see what happens. And I think this is what Stuart said earlier. Crowdsourcing is very nice, but it's sort of a popularity contest. I really like, even though I sometimes rail against it, I like peer review. I like people realistically looking at the research and using their expertise to judge me, as I think that I should be able to judge other people's research as well. Crowdsourcing, unless there was something, it becomes a little bit of a popularity contest for that. I can see a real use for it, but in terms of general scientific funding, biological funding, I would be very wary of it.
There are very interesting possibilities that are being explored, one of which is not actually in the funding realm, but in terms of clinical trials, where the ideas, because it's hard to get populations and recruit patient populations for clinical trials. So those clinical trials are put forth before the community of individuals with that particular condition or disease. And there's kind of decisions that are made by people volunteering based on what those clinical trials are, you know, what their orientation is. And you simply can't gather a group for a clinical trial if it doesn't have a certain amount of popularity within that subgroup. And as far as the crowdsourcing of financing, we've certainly thought about it, but it's still a challenge in terms of the regulatory and a number of aspects. It's a very fluid region right now.
So,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're reaching the end, or we have reached the end of our time, and I hate to cut off a very rich discussion, but I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative for 2 minutes, and I'm going to do an artificial constraint and a lightning round, mostly because I'm curious, but I suspect some of the audience might be too, limiting you to 1 minute for this question. We've talked about the vast amount of information we do know, the incredibly exciting possibilities. What I'm curious about is to hear from each of you very briefly, what is the thing we don't know or the tool we don't have that you think would be completely disruptive or we need to sort of, is the next big body of information we need to start tackling? I'm going to start with you, Dr. Frierson.
Well, interesting that
And I am going to limit this
Okay.
because I'm going to get in trouble.
So I maybe have a quirky answer because I actually wrote a book a year ago called Ignorance and how important this is to science, because I think it's far more important than the fact. So I'd say that disruptive technology is ignorance, and that we need more of it, that we need more questions, fewer answers, if you will, and that we need to understand that the answers beget better questions. It's not that the answers are an end in themselves, but that they get us to a better, more sophisticated level of ignorance. But that ignorance is with us to stay, and we should revel in that.
Well, it's a renewable resource.
Yes, that's certainly true.
To me, it's not a particular area. I don't know where the next breakthroughs will be. It's the idea that the use of huge amounts of information, increasing amounts of information very broadly, and the capability of individuals both to design pseudo-trials in a quantitative self sort of a way to sort of attempt things on their own, and this sort of bottoms-up science that is developing in terms of trying to make applications of therapeutic possibilities in all sorts of realms.
So I would sort of repeat all of these things, and really something I said at the very beginning. I think that I agree. We don't know what the big breakthroughs are going to be. We know that we're on the way to many breakthroughs in understanding the human genome, in understanding how genes are interacting, understanding how our microbiome, all these other parts of our body, all these bacteria that actually constitute more cells than we have of human cells, how they interact, how they work together. These are all things that are going to come up, but what we really need is the support of the basic understanding of these. I think there's plenty of people that want to work on a whole variety of problems. I think that those are going to bring the breakthroughs as long as we support basic research.
Wonderful. Well, I want us all to thank our panelists for a wonderful conversation,
Thank you all.
and
Thank you all.
the audience as well.